Congratulations, you're the first generation since the end of the Cold War where a nuclear apocalypse is a very real and likely possibility. So turn that frown upside down, because if you've been concerned over unaffordable housing, crushing student debt, wage inequality, global warming, and more, then nuclear war is the answer you didn't even know you were looking for. What are the odds that things will go nuclear in a hurry, though? Happily for all of us, the odds are actually quite excellent. The first and most likely source of a nuclear Armageddon that eradicates human life from Earth is the ongoing war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has been rattling his nuclear saber ever since the Russian army made a brave advance toward Belarus from the outskirts of Kyiv. Suddenly, Ukraine was no longer the pushover they and the rest of the world thought it would be, and things only went from bad to worse when the Russian army suffered more defeats during the 2022 autumn offensive. Since then, despite House Speaker Mike Johnson and MAGA Republicans blocking Ukraine aid and allowing Putin's army to begin to score victories, Russia is still in pretty dire straits. With Johnson threatened with being removed from the speakership, though, he suddenly found the fortitude to agree to pass a massive Ukrainian aid bill that threatened to create significant problems for Russia. Europe's massive ramp-up in aid and arms manufacturing is also slated to not just catch up to Russia's now wartime economy, but surpass it in both scope and capability. The question is, now that the West has finally taken the Ukraine war seriously, what happens when Russia's clown shoes army starts to suffer significant war-losing defeats? How will Vladimir Putin respond to the West at last providing war-winning levels of equipment while his own factories and oil refineries are increasingly under Ukrainian drone attack? With no means to score a conventional victory, will Putin turn to weapons of mass destruction? If he should do so, the United States has already pledged to retaliate. In a conversation with his Russian counterpart, the U.S. Secretary of Defense stated that the U.S. would destroy any unit responsible for launching a nuclear weapon. A second attack would result in the destruction of the facility from where the attack was launched. A third attack with nuclear weapons would result in the U.S. forces launching an all-out attack against Russian forces in Ukraine. Russia's been doing a pretty lackluster job scoring gradual victories over Ukraine's exhausted, under-trained, and under-equipped army. Up against the might of the United States military and its allies, Russia would crumple like Chris Rock getting smacked at the Oscars. Keep NATO's name out your mouth. But that's a bad thing, not a good one, because it forces an already desperate Russia back into the corner. And Putin's very survival likely depends on not getting completely obliterated in Ukraine, to say nothing of his massive ego. Thus, the condition for the use of nuclear weapons is set, and any nuclear attack against the US or NATO forces only ends in one way: Russia being turned into the world's largest radioactive parking lot. Unfortunately, despite the odds that Dmitry and his buddies sold the nuclear warheads and the missiles for vodka and turnip money being very high, at least some of Russia's missiles are likely to find their targets in the US and abroad. But this isn't the only nuclear flashpoint, because everyone's favorite bad boy, Kim Jong-un, has got himself nuclear weapons. Knowing that losing a war against South Korea and the US means an end to his dynasty, Kim Jong is extremely motivated to use nuclear weapons before they're destroyed by the US or ROK Special Forces and aircraft. This would prompt a nuclear response from the United States, given that South Korea is under America's nuclear umbrella. Not only does North Korea have weapons that can now reach the continental US, but there is the China question. How would China respond to multiple nuclear impacts right across its own border, knowing that massive plumes of radiation and debris would be blown inland by ocean breezes and into China's most populated regions? In effect, a nuclear attack on North Korea is a nuclear attack on China, and President Xi is unlikely to sit on his hands. His own political survival and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party would be at stake, motivating him to respond with either conventional or nuclear force. And from there, it's a short spiral to total nuclear destruction. But the really good news is that we don't have to wait for war to be mercifully shuffled off this mortal coil by cleansing nuclear fire. At any moment, with heightened tensions between the world's major nuclear powers, any sort of equipment malfunction could trigger a nuclear war. But no, we hear you say, there's no way any simple error could trigger nuclear Armageddon. Surely, nuclear weapons and their related support systems are only watched over and maintained by the most competent of individuals and the best maintained equipment. Oh, sweet summer child, we too miss the naivete of youth. There have been so many close calls due to human error that, frankly, our continued existence on this planet might be all the proof anyone needs of a higher power. In 1956, NORAD was flooded with reports of Soviet MiG fighters in Syria unidentified aircraft entering Turkey, a British bomber being downed, and sudden maneuvers carried out by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. This looked to the U.S. personnel exactly like the makings of a first strike against NATO, prompting fears that European partners would carry out nuclear retaliation. Except for the unidentified aircraft over Turkey, which was a bunch of swans flying in formation, and the Soviet fighters in Syrian airspace were a presidential escort for Syrian President Shukri al-Quwatli. The British bomber that was apparently downed, possibly by Soviet fire, well, it experienced a mechanical malfunction, and the sudden maneuvering of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet wasn't a preparation for an attack, it was part of a publicly announced and scheduled exercise. Thanks to the recent solar eclipse, social media is awash with all sorts of moon conspiracy theories. But in 1960, the moon wasn't just fake, it was a full-blown Soviet nuclear first strike. Radar equipment stationed at Thule, Greenland, with the job of detecting incoming Soviet missiles flying over the North Pole, mistook the rising moon as a swarm of missiles. The only thing that stopped a massive counterattack was the fact that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in New York City at the time for a UN meeting. A year later, Strategic Air Command Headquarters suddenly lost contact with NORAD and multiple ballistic missile early warning sites. These communication links were all hardwired and independent of each other, making it incredibly improbable that they would all experience a simultaneous malfunction. This left only one option: Soviet sabotage in preparation for a nuclear attack. SAC proceeded to prepare the entire American bomber force for a strike against the Soviet Union until it was discovered that while each of these lines of communication was independent and redundant, somebody had the bright idea to run them all through the same relay station in Colorado, a relay station that had experienced a technical malfunction. In 1962, a bear nearly ended the world. This was the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the U.S. military expected the Soviets to carry out sabotage just before a nuclear first strike. At midnight on October 25th, a guard at the Duluth Sector Direction Center spotted a figure climbing the security fence. He activated the sabotage alarm, setting off similar alarms across the entire region. However, at Volk Field in Wisconsin, faulty wiring meant that instead of the alarm sounding, a klaxon alerted Air Defense Command nuclear-armed F-106A interceptors to launch immediately. The crews of these aircraft had been told that there would be no drills and thus believed that a nuclear war was already taking place. It was only an officer in the command center who drove his car onto the runway and stopped the aircraft from taking off. The intruder was also eventually identified as a curious black bear. Those aircraft could have been recalled via radio, maybe. Recognizing the potential for enemy spoofing, most nuclear crews were instructed to completely ignore radio calls once they were airborne in a real-world scenario. Like the crew of a French nuclear-armed Mirage 4 in 1966, which due to a thunderstorm disrupting electrical transmissions, received a wartime takeoff order by accident. The jet was on the way to deliver its AN-11 atomic bomb to its target and ignored all radio calls as per their training. However, the heavily burdened jet required in-air refueling, and when they reached their rendezvous point, there was no tanker waiting for them. They were forced to turn back to base and abort their mission. It was only then that they learned of the error. If you think these kinds of errors are limited to the past, when early warning systems and nukes were pretty new, you'd be incorrect. In 1995, Norway nearly ended all creation by launching a simple research rocket. Russia had been informed of the launch beforehand, but nobody had bothered to tell the Russian radar operators manning the nation's early warning system. The detected launch began on a trajectory perfectly mirroring that of an expected American first strike using submarine-launched weapons close to Russian shores. This actually caused Russian President Boris Yeltsin to activate the nuclear football, and for a few minutes, the world was a button press away from destruction. Are you feeling better yet? We hope so, because no matter what problems you're facing, nuclear war is close enough to take them all away. But how would you personally be affected? Will you be one of the lucky hundreds of millions who get to leave the world behind via nuclear obliteration? Or will you be a cast member in Amazon Prime Video's Season 2 of Fallout? There are 4 primary targets for a nuclear strike, and both the US and Russia have the hardware to hit all of them in a full-blown exchange. You might think major cities would be the first target, but you'd be wrong. First up on the nuclear chopping block is each other's nuclear capabilities. This means missile fields and nuclear weapon storage depots. The attacking nation would hope to eliminate their opponent's nuclear capabilities before a retaliatory strike could be launched, or at least a significant portion of them, to limit the number of weapons that could be used against them. This move favors the one who shoots first, which is why the nuclear triad is so important. With the ability to launch nuclear weapons via air, sea, and missile silos, nations become resistant to devastating first strikes. Next up are centers of government and military power. This means capitals like Washington and the Kremlin, but also major military installations and naval bases. Believe it or not, each nation would expect a conventional war to follow a nuclear one, or at least have to act like such a thing would be possible. Thus, major troop concentrations and stockpiles of equipment would be targets for the nuclear flame. Are you an E2 with a 45% interest loan on a brand new Dodge Charger? Don't worry, a nuclear bomb is en route to renegotiate that loan to 0% interest and 0 payments. Surely you're probably thinking, now I'll be set free from the burden of existence by nuclear attacks that hit major cities. Well, you'd still be wrong, because next up are targets of strategic importance for the long-term survival of a nation. This is nuclear war, after all, one of the few types of war left where the express intent is the complete eradication of a nation-state. This means wiping out food and resource production areas. Hate the impact that fossil fuels are having on our environment? You're gonna love it when nuclear bombs annihilate and irradiate vast swaths of the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, Alaska, and other oil and coal-producing areas of the United States. It's the ultimate Green New Deal, with everything glowing green with radioactivity. Literally overnight, nuclear war will bring humanity's carbon emissions to zero. So if you're an environmentalist, then vote for a nuclear war in the next election. Millions of people suffer from gluten allergies that severely impact their health, and exponentially millions more don't actually know what a gluten is or refuse to eat it because it's trendy not to know science. The good news is, for both of those crowds, that nuclear war will solve gluten allergies forever. With the massive grain-producing territories of the United States and Russia, who provide the bulk of the world's grain, all blanketed with nuclear strikes. If you hate the cruelty of factory farming, the good news is nuclear weapons will forever liberate hundreds of millions of animals across American and Russian farms. The point of these strikes is to literally starve your opponent into extinction and thus prevent them from rebuilding their society. Alright, it's finally here. We've teased you long enough. With nuclear infrastructure destroyed, major government and military centers in ruins, and most farmland and strategic resource sites irradiated, it's finally your turn. It's finally time to be set free from the nightmare of late-stage runaway capitalism. It's just a prank bro social media influencers and a government dominated by geriatrics. Now the cities are targeted, with major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Dallas up first on the chopping block. The destruction of major financial and cultural sectors is paramount to the goal of complete obliteration of the enemy. The 9/11 terror attacks in New York City, in which only a small part of the city's financial sector was destroyed, still resulted in nearly a 1% GDP loss for the entire nation. Economists will tell you that nuclear war is bad for the economy. But what their propaganda doesn't show you is how nuclear Armageddon is the fastest and only way to reduce inflation to exactly 0%. These same financial experts will also tell you that runaway housing market requires careful legislation and market correction. What they won't tell you is that nothing will permanently fix the housing market and make homes affordable again, like the annihilation of every major urban center, along with the instantaneous death of over 50% of the population. Is nuclear war the solution to your problem of buying a new home somewhere you actually want to live because property is unrealistically expensive due to the runaway greed in an unregulated market? Now, we're not saying it is, but we're just saying that before you bash nuclear war, you might want to consider the positives. Nuclear war gets a bad rep, but the truth is it guarantees that either all your problems will be immediately solved or all your problems will be immediately solved because the sources of those problems are now radioactive ash. Sure, there will be new problems, but those can be fun problems with the right mindset. Hypocrites, after all, will play games like Fallout to escape their daily lives, but when they get to play Fallout for real, they'll complain about it. But what if you have a horrible misfortune of living somewhere that nuclear weapons aren't currently threatening? Somewhere like South America or Africa. Well, we hate to tell you, but the odds of you surviving a global nuclear exchange are actually pretty good. Don't worry though, you'll soon know the sweet release of death thanks to the rapidly collapsing global order and the effects of fallout. There are very few nations that are truly self-sufficient to any degree. Japan, for example, is so non-self-sufficient in food production that it recently became a national priority to increase the amount of farming done at home. Most of the products you buy today are shipped in from somewhere else. And even if you live in a nation large and diversified enough to have some amount of self-sufficiency, those goods still need to be shipped to your location. The number of nations who can produce their own oil, let alone refine it, is significantly low, even lower in the case of nuclear war, as many of those nations would be targets themselves. During COVID-19, we saw the effect of disrupted global supply chains, or at least got a small taste of what pre-globalization used to be like. The problem is nations were once used to being largely self-reliant, or conducting most of their trade with nearby neighbors. Globalization has drawn the world together, but it also means that the components for things you use every day are built in 10 different countries and assembled in the 11th. It's not impossible for nations not directly affected by nuclear war to survive, but it will be very difficult, and their economies will shrink dramatically. This would lead to widespread chaos and economic collapse as millions cannot find work or afford food. Many of those nations would be eyeing their neighbors hungrily, eager to take their resources for themselves in order to maintain their own survival, and there would be nobody to actually stop them, with major powers like Brazil and Egypt easily swallowing up their neighbors. For all the flack the US gets for its global military presence, the US military helps stabilize the world by dissuading bad actors from starting a fight they'll lose. War never changes, and in the wake of a nuclear apocalypse, it would once more become mankind's favorite hobby. Brutal resource wars, likely with the use of non-nuclear WMDs like chemical and biological weapons, would be waged. Mass migration from nations targeted by nuclear weapons would create the greatest immigration catastrophe in history, and these migrants would likely still be extremely well armed. Despite the destruction of major military infrastructure, affected nations could likely still wield significant military strength, significant enough to overrun neighboring lesser powers. And with the gloves at last finally off, these nuclear states, who will have maintained a small reserve of nuclear weapons, would be very likely to use the nukes to get their way, especially against nations who can't retaliate in the same way. That brings us back home, because even if you survive the initial strikes, and by some miracle society continues, then congratulations, because you're getting drafted into the military. With Russia and the US absolutely crippled by nuclear strikes, both nations would turn their surviving military might on nations that were not initially targeted. Seizing resources from regional neighbors would be a matter of national survival, launching mankind into an age of resource wars. But in all likelihood, the end result, for everyone on Earth from such a massive nuclear assault, is simply extinction. Nations may limp along for a few years, but the effect of so much radioactive debris being spread across the planet is both an ecological collapse and climate disruption severe enough to seal humanity's fate. Mankind may be able to tolerate violent climate swings or even background radiation levels so elevated that everyone now has extra limbs, but the complex food web that we rely on could not. The total ecological collapse of the planet is inevitable from a full-scale nuclear exchange, with the only hope of survival being specially constructed shelters deep underground that could hold tiny populations for a century or more. We're pretty confident Elon Musk will eventually start building shelters that will definitely not be used to conduct unethical human experiments. Musk, after all, will need to ensure a portion of humanity survives to fight off Mark Zuckerberg's army of cyborgs for the ultimate fate of planet Earth. Now, if you want to be a spoilsport, then click here for how to actually survive a nuclear attack, or click this other video instead.